Hello and welcome to Louise Singleton Creations. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know that usually I have lots and lots of ideas going around in my head and they even keep me awake at night. But just recently, I was lacking in ideas. It does happen sometimes, but I just didn't know where to go for my next video. So I decided to ask my patrons to inspire me. So I went over to Patreon and asked my lovely patrons for a list of 3 ingredients. The first ingredient would be a colour, the second would be the material I should use, and the third would be an embellishment or addition. I then needed to choose at least one from each of the suggestions, and that would make the recipe for today's project. So here's the list that I got, and I'm going for the colour of periwinkle and I'm using resin, so that's from Christy. From Jennifer, I've gone with the mixed media idea. From Kerry, I've gone with purple and dipping resin, and from Casey, I've chosen Aquacast. So if you would like to see what I make with all of those ingredients, and let me tell you, it was a bit of a challenge, stay tuned and enjoy the video. Right then, to incorporate all of those different ingredients, I decided to make some coasters. I'm using my hexagonal coaster mould from Moulds and Shapes, and I'm just getting everything ready now. I've got my levelling table ready. That's really useful. I'll put a link to that in my video description, and I'm protecting it there with a silicone mat. I decided to do the Aquacast first in a thin layer on the base of the coasters as a kind of background for the decoration that will come afterwards. So now I need to prepare the Aquacast. First I measured out my tap water and then I measured the Aquacast powder. Then I gave it a really good stir and added the periwinkle blue pigment from Homeware Design. So that's periwinkle and Aquacast ticked off my list. So this video is more for inspiration rather than being a tutorial. Because it was so time consuming with it being a challenge and quite a complex challenge at that, I didn't think it would be useful as a tutorial, and that's why I'm keeping everything quite brief really and hoping that it will give you some inspiration. You might have noticed that I didn't give it a very good mix after adding the pigment, and that's because I didn't want it to be thoroughly mixed. I wanted a kind of marbled effect, and you can see it kind of taking form there, and I was pleased with that. And I was also pleased that it faded a lot as it cured. It didn't stay as dark as it was. I was slightly concerned when I was mixing it. I thought I'd added too much pigment, but as it dried and cured, it faded, so that was good in this instance. Once I'd finished pouring the Aquacast, I teased it to the edges. I didn't want too much in, so I didn't pour in enough for it to naturally flow to the edges. I had to tease it there myself so that I could keep that very thin layer. Aquacast cures in about 40 minutes, but I actually left this for a couple of days to fully dry out before sealing it. And because I couldn't take it out the mould, it had to stay in the mould. It took longer to completely dry out. And I didn't want to trap water in there by sealing it too early. So I left it 2 days. But that was all right because I had all the other elements to prepare before adding them. So I've got my Hydroflow sealer here. That's also from Elichem Resins. That's where I get the Aquacast from. And I'm just brushing it on with a soft paintbrush and allowing that to dry. Once the sealer was dry, as an extra precaution, I decided to seal it again, but this time with UV resin. The thing is, I was a bit concerned that if I poured my epoxy resin directly onto that sealed Aquacast, it might still kind of soak in because resin takes a long time to cure. It would have a long time in which to seep into the Aquacast and possibly darken it and maybe make some, patterns in there that I didn't want. So yeah, I thought if I seal it very quickly with UV resin, it only takes a couple of minutes. The UV resin will seal it without soaking in, and it won't darken the Aquacast. That's kind of the process that was going on in my head anyway, and that's why I'm doing that now. So yeah, it's up to you. If you do something like this, you could put the epoxy resin directly onto the Aquacast, but I think it would make it darker, and I didn't want it darker. Right, that's the base all prepared. Let's get on with the decorations. Now, one of the ingredient suggestions was from Carrie, and she said to use dipping resin. And I had dipping resin left over from my kit, which I got a few months ago from Inion Arts. You might have seen the video. And so I'm using the wire and the tools which I got in my kit. And yeah, I really do love the dipping resin, so I'm glad that Carrie suggested that. It gave me an excuse to get it all out and have another go. And all I'm doing is making shapes with the wire by wrapping it around the wooden tool that came with it. I've made a circle there, and I'm just elongating it to make a petal shape. Luckily, it's very quick and easy to make them because I had to make absolutely loads and loads of them. Anyway, that's the small one that you've just seen. Then I made a bigger one in the same way, but this time I stretched it and didn't fatten it out as much. I wanted some long, slim petals. And so that's what I'm making here. And they're going to be my purple ones. So yeah, very simple. Just, yeah, twist it, make the shapes, and it's done. So once I'd finished making the shapes, it was time for the dipping. And I will be using dipping resin for this, which is an acrylic resin, and it's air drying, and it dries really quickly. In about 10 or 15 minutes, it's done. And I love that. So yeah, 3 different resins in today's video. We've got epoxy, UV, and acrylic. So yeah, it's quite a combination. The colour I'm using first for my small petals is Sunset Orange, and I really love this shade. And yeah, so you just take it by the long bit of wire that you've left at the end of your petal, dip it in, and that's it. Let the excess drip off, and then once all that's dripped off or you've wiped it on the side, just stick it into the Oasis to dry. And like I said just a minute ago, 10 or 15 minutes later, it's ready. So when I made my first video using this, there were a lot of people from all around the world really quite upset because they couldn't order it. It was a UK thing, and yeah, because it's flammable, they couldn't really ship it to anywhere other than the UK. But because there was so much interest, what Inion Arts have done is they've come up with a dry formula which just needs the addition of acetone. So you can order it if you're in a different country now and get the powder form shipped to you, and then dilute it yourself with acetone, and then you'll have your own dipping resin. So I think that's really fabulous news. Right, so this next one is the purple one, and I really like this as well. I think my favourite colour is the orange, but yeah, here's the purple. I've only actually got 3 colours, purple, green and orange, but that was enough for this video. And so there's the purple one, nice and easy. So once all my petals were prepared, all I needed to do was snip off the excess wire with some wire cutters, and then it was time to arrange them on my coasters. The lighting was very bad when I filmed my first coaster, so I decided to film again once I'd done 3 of them and just show you the last one. I'm using UV resin from Jade Diction to attach my petals to the coasters, and it's quite straightforward, as you will see. I used my tweezers to pick them up because they're very small and delicate, but the UV resin did work really well for this. Yeah, it's repositionable, obviously. Until you've cured it, you can move your petals around if you don't like the position, so that's really good. And then once you have got the position, you can put it under your UV lamp I would say for 5 minutes altogether, because, it takes a bit longer to cure when it's covered up like this. The light can't get to it quite so easily, so it will need a little bit longer to cure. But then once it's cured, they're not going to move, so I think it's a better way to do it than to use glue, but it's just my personal choice. And I don't know if you can see, but there's some spots of resin at the end of each petal. I found that some of them were kind of curving up more than I wanted them to, and I wanted them to be not sticking out the top of the coasters, so I stuck them down individually to make sure they stayed in position. So yeah, that is something you can do. These petals can be bent. They're not going to shatter or crack if you bend them after they've cured. They're quite flexible. So yeah, I just stuck them down a little bit more. And once everything was in place, I decided to add some crushed glass in the centre of the orange flowers. And it's from Laura's Art Corner. It's called, Gold Fusion, I think. And I love this gold crushed glass. It's really nice. Oh yeah, there we go. Gold Fusion. So that's my choice for the centre of the orange ones. And once again, I used the J. Diction UV resin as my glue and just scooped the crushed glass onto the glue and cured it under the UV lamp. And then it was time to do the purple flower. And for the centre of this one, I decided to use my purpley blue seed beads, which I must have had for 10 to 15 years in my crafty stash. Really, I've had them that long. I just loved them so much, but never really found a use for them. So today they get used, and I think they are such a pretty colour. At this stage, I did like the way they were looking, but there was something missing. And so I decided to add some more of the Gold Fusion crushed glass into this area here that you can see me doing. I think that really finished it off nicely. And I just tried to arrange it so that they were all the same. I've got a little micro brush there just to move them around so it's more of a uniform kind of shape. I didn't want it too random. I wanted a certain shape, and as you can see, it worked quite well. And I think that finished it off nicely. Right then, it's time to fill the coasters up, and I'm using Ultracast epoxy resin, and that's from Elichem Resins, the same as the Aquacast. It's a heat-resistant resin, which makes it perfect for coasters because it means you don't need to do a separate heat-resistant top coat afterwards. You can just make your coasters with it, so it's perfect. However, I did end up doing a top coat. Let me tell you why. So this resin is crystal clear and it's got a beautiful finish. So there was no problem with the resin. However, there was a problem with what I'd done. There was so much air trapped under all those petals, like little pockets of air. I knew that they would be trying to come up out from underneath of there while the resin was curing, and I did babysit it for a long time. As those big pockets of air started to escape, I was popping them, but you can't babysit it for hours and hours, can you, until it's fully cured. And once I left the room, some big bubbles came up. And yeah, I didn't film it actually, I should have done, but there were 1 or 2 really big bubbles that came up from under those petals that spoiled the surface of the coasters. And so what I did when they were cured was I gave them a bit of a sanding and gave them a flood coat on top. Oh, can you see those big bubbles there on the top right one? Those are the kind of bubbles I'm talking about, where it's pockets of air escaping. So I gently used my heat gun to pop those every time they came up. So here they are, finished. Let's have a closer look. As you can see, I've done a little bit of gold edging with my gold pen before I did that top coat which I spoke about. I thought, seeing as I'm having to do a top coat, I might as well take the chance to make a nice gold edge. And I think they look really pretty. There's a few imperfections in there, and you can see some pockets of air that are still in there behind the petals, but I still think they look really beautiful, and I love the way they catch the light. I also love the way they fit together to make one big flower like this. That wasn't planned, it was just an accident, and I think it looks really good. So yeah, that's a really good little bonus. I enjoyed this project so much. I think a challenge does you good now and again. It really gets your cogs in your brain turning. And yeah, it was quite a challenge. It took a long time, but it was worth it. So a big thank you has to go to my lovely patrons over on Patreon, and also to Elichem Resins for supplying the fabulous Aquacast and Ultracast. And that's it. We've come to the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next week. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.